It is the morning of September 10th, 1945. The war in Europe has been over for 4 months. Japan surrendered 3 weeks ago. America is exhaling slowly, collectively, gratefully, after the longest and most terrible conflict in human history. People are coming home. Factories are retooling. The country is ready, desperately ready, for things to be normal again. In Fruita, Colorado, a small farming town in the western part of the state, nestled in the Grand Valley near the Utah border, a farmer named Lloyd Olsen is doing something entirely normal. He is preparing chickens for dinner. He picks up a Wyandotte rooster. He places it on the chopping block. He raises the axe. He swings. The rooster's head comes off. And then the rooster gets up. This is not unusual in itself. Chickens famously continue to move after decapitation. The phrase, running around like a headless chicken, exists because it happens, because the nerve impulses in the body continue to fire for a brief period after the head is removed. It is unpleasant to observe, but it is well understood, and it stops within a few seconds or minutes. Mike did not stop. Mike walked around the farmyard. Mike went to roost with the other chickens that evening. Mike woke up the following morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Mike was alive. Or at least Mike was something. Something that walked and breathed and pecked at the ground and attempted, with the stump of his neck, to preen himself in the morning. Something that continued, day after day, week after week, month after month, to do the things that a chicken does minus the parts that require a head. Lloyd Olsen, confronted with this situation, made a series of decisions that were entirely logical given who he was and when he lived. He fed Mike. He took Mike to scientists. He took Mike on the road. And for 18 months, Mike the headless chicken became the most famous bird in America. This is his story, which is also, in its way, a story about survival, about consciousness, about what we mean when we say something is alive, and about the particular genius of the American sideshow for turning the genuinely extraordinary into an attraction that charges 25 cents admission. To understand how Mike came to be, you need to understand the world he came from. Lloyd Olsen was a farmer in Fruita, Colorado in 1945. Fruita sits in Mesa County in the western slope region of Colorado, a landscape of red rock mesas, irrigated farmland along the Colorado River, and the particular quality of light that the high desert of the American West produces in the late summer and early autumn. It is beautiful country, though farming it requires the constant management of irrigation and the rhythms of a growing season that the surrounding desert would happily reclaim if given the chance. The Olsens were a working farming family. Lloyd and his wife Clara raised chickens, among other animals, in the way that farming families of that era did, not as a large commercial operation, but as part of the integrated, largely self-sufficient economy of a family farm. Chickens provided eggs, and occasionally, when the time came, meat. September 10th, 1945, was a day when it was time. Lloyd was preparing a batch of chickens, and his mother-in-law, Clara's mother, who was visiting, had expressed a preference for chicken with as much neck as possible left attached. This is not an unusual culinary preference. The neck of a chicken contains a modest amount of meat, and when cooked, contributes significantly to the flavor of broth and stock. Many people who cook whole chickens prefer them prepared with the neck intact. This preference, this entirely ordinary, entirely understandable culinary preference of one woman for a particular cut of chicken, is the reason Mike the headless chicken existed. Because Lloyd, attempting to satisfy his mother-in-law's preference, positioned his axe higher than he otherwise would have. He swung to take the head but leave the maximum amount of neck, and in doing so, he placed the blade at a position where the specific anatomy of this particular rooster produced an outcome that was, in the technical sense, almost astronomically improbable. The axe severed the head. It missed the jugular vein on the right side. It missed enough of the brainstem, the lowest, most primitive part of the brain, where it connects to the spinal cord at the base of the skull, that the neural structures responsible for the rooster's most basic life functions remained intact and operational. The head came off. Mike did not die. Lloyd observed his rooster walking around the farmyard after decapitation and did what most people would do in that situation. He waited for the inevitable cessation of movement that follows decapitation. It did not come. By the following morning, it was clear that something genuinely unusual had occurred. Mike was roosting with the other chickens. He was making the movements associated with preening. He was responding to disturbances in his environment in ways that suggested active, ongoing neurological function rather than the residual nerve firing of a dying bird. Lloyd faced a decision. He could simply kill Mike properly, a quick, definitive second intervention that would end the situation cleanly, or he could see what happened next. Lloyd Olsen was a practical man. He was also a curious one. And he was a man with a mother-in-law who had, however inadvertently, set in motion something that the world had probably never seen before. He decided to see what happened next. He began feeding Mike. Before we follow Mike and Lloyd on their journey into American popular culture, let us spend some time with the question that scientists and curious people have been asking ever since the story first became public. How was this possible? The answer requires a brief excursion into the anatomy of a chicken's brain, and into the broader question of what brains actually do, which turns out to be more interesting and more complicated than most people realize. The brain of any vertebrate animal, fish, reptile, bird, mammal, is not a uniform structure. It is organized into distinct regions that evolved at different points in the history of animal life, and that perform different functions. The older, more primitive parts of the brain, the ones that evolved earliest and that sit physically at the base and center of the brain structure, control the most basic life functions: breathing, heart rate, basic reflexes, the maintenance of the body's core physiological processes. These functions are automatic, unconscious, and continuous. They do not require thought. They do not require awareness. They simply happen as long as the relevant neural tissue is intact. The newer, more recently evolved parts of the brain in mammals, most dramatically the cerebral cortex, and in birds, the equivalent structures in the forebrain control higher functions: perception, learning, voluntary movement, social behavior, the kind of flexible, experience-based response to the environment that we associate with intelligence and awareness. In a chicken, the cerebral hemispheres, the forebrain structures responsible for higher cognitive functions, sit in the front and upper portion of the skull. The brainstem, controlling basic life functions, sits at the base of the skull, where the brain connects to the spinal cord. When Lloyd Olsen's axe came down on September 10, 1945, it severed the head at a point that removed the cerebral hemispheres but left enough of the brainstem intact for the basic life functions to continue. Mike's heart kept beating. His respiratory system kept functioning. His digestive system kept operating. The reflexive, automatic behaviors controlled by the brainstem, the pecking response, the preening response, the roosting behavior, continued because the neural tissue that controlled them was still there and still receiving blood supply through the circulatory system that the intact heart was maintaining. The blood clotted at the wound site, preventing fatal hemorrhage. The remaining brainstem tissue, while damaged, was sufficient to maintain the minimum viable physiology of a living chicken. Mike was not, in any meaningful sense, conscious. He had no forebrain. He had no capacity for perception, learning, social recognition, or anything we would associate with subjective experience. When he appeared to preen or peck, these were automatic brainstem reflexes, not voluntary behaviors, not evidence of a thinking mind, but the mechanical continuation of neural programs that did not require conscious direction. This distinction matters both scientifically and ethically. Mike was not suffering, because suffering requires a nervous system capable of subjective experience, and Mike's was not. He was not aware of his situation, because awareness requires exactly the forebrain structures that were gone. He was, in the most precise technical sense, alive without being conscious. This is a genuinely profound concept that Mike's case illuminates in an unusually vivid way. Life and consciousness, which we tend to conflate, which feel, from the inside, like the same thing, are separable. Life can persist without consciousness. The machinery can keep running after the operator has left. Scientists at the University of Utah confirmed all of this when Lloyd brought Mike to them for examination. They were skeptical initially. The story of a headless chicken surviving was not the kind of claim that the scientific establishment of 1945 was predisposed to accept without evidence. But Mike was evidence. Walking, if you want to call it that, evidence. The scientists examined him, documented the anatomy, confirmed that there was no fraud involved, and concluded that the survival was genuine and explicable by the specific anatomy of the wound. Their verification was important. It transformed Mike from a local curiosity into a scientifically authenticated phenomenon. Which is when Lloyd Olsen began to think about the commercial possibilities. America in 1945 was a country with a long and enthusiastic tradition of the sideshow. The traveling exhibition of curiosities, unusual people, unusual animals, unusual objects, had been a feature of American popular culture since at least the early 19th century. P.T. Barnum had built an empire on it. The Dime Museum, the traveling show, the Carnival Midway, these were institutions of American entertainment, drawing crowds in every city and town in the country with the promise of the genuinely strange, the hard to believe, the thing you would tell your friends about for years. By 1945, the golden age of the sideshow was fading. Radio, cinema, and the general rise of mass media entertainment were providing competition that traveling curiosity shows could not fully match. But the appetite for the genuinely unusual, the verifiably bizarre, the thing that defied ordinary expectation, that appetite was perennial. Mike the Headless Chicken was the most verifiably bizarre thing in America. Lloyd Olsen was not, by nature, a showman. He was a farmer, but he was also a practical man who recognized an extraordinary opportunity when it walked around his farmyard without a head. He took Mike on the road. The show was simple. Lloyd would exhibit Mike, the living, walking, breathing headless rooster, to paying audiences, charging 25 cents per person. For 25 cents in 1945, you could see the most extraordinary animal in American history. People paid in enormous numbers. Mike was exhibited in sideshows and exhibitions across the country. He was featured in Time magazine and Life magazine, the two most widely read publications in America at the time. His story was reported by newspapers from coast to coast. He was, for a period of several months in 1945 and 1946, genuinely nationally famous, the kind of fame that reached into living rooms and lunch counters and barbershops and produced the same response everywhere. Disbelief, followed by fascination, followed by a strong desire to see it for yourself. At his commercial peak, Mike was generating approximately $4,500 per month in exhibition revenue. in 1945 dollars. This is approximately $75,000 per month in contemporary terms, a remarkable income for a farmer from Fruita, Colorado, derived entirely from the exhibition of a chicken who had survived an axe. Mike was insured for $10,000, a significant sum reflecting his commercial value and a measure of how seriously Lloyd was taking his unlikely business enterprise. Lloyd was also, whatever his commercial motivations, genuinely attentive to Mike's welfare. He fed him carefully, using an eyedropper to deliver a mixture of milk and water and small grains of corn directly into the esophagus, the feeding tube, that remained intact in Mike's neck stump. The feeding had to bypass the absent beak and mouth entirely, going directly into the digestive system that, like everything below the wound site, was functioning normally. Mike gained weight during his headless period. He weighed approximately 2.5 pounds at the time of the axe and reached approximately 8 pounds during the 18 months of his headless life. This weight gain is one of the most remarkable facts in the story, and one of the clearest evidence that the feeding and care Lloyd was providing was genuinely sustaining him. A headless chicken that gains weight is a chicken that is, by any metabolic measure, thriving. Mike also, during this period, became something of a media personality in his own right. Or rather, Lloyd became a media personality on Mike's behalf, since Mike's capacity for self-promotion was limited by the absence of a head. Lloyd gave interviews. He posed for photographs with Mike. He answered questions from scientists, journalists, and curious members of the public with the straightforward, patient manner of a man who had grown accustomed to the extraordinary nature of his situation. There is a remarkable photograph from this period that captures something essential about the whole story. Lloyd Olsen, a solidly built, weathered Colorado farmer, holding Mike, the headless rooster, in the crook of his arm. Both of them are facing the camera with what can only be described as equanimity. Lloyd looks like a man who has made his peace with the fact that his life has taken an unusual turn. Mike looks like a headless chicken. But there is something in the image that is oddly companionable. These two beings, farmer and rooster, navigating together the strange territory that Lloyd's axe had opened up. What was it actually like to be on the road with Mike? This is a question that the historical record addresses only partially. Lloyd gave interviews, but he was not a man given to extensive self-reflection in public, and the accounts of the road show that survive are mostly from the perspective of journalists and curious observers rather than from Lloyd himself. But we can piece together something of the picture. Lloyd and Mike traveled primarily through the American West and Southwest in 1945 and 1946, the circuit of towns and small cities that the sideshow and traveling exhibition tradition had established over decades. They appeared in California, Nevada, Arizona, and various other states, as well as making appearances in larger cities where the national publicity had created demand. The exhibition setup was straightforward. Mike would be displayed walking, pecking reflexively at the ground, making the movement of the stump that observers described as resembling an attempt to crow, and Lloyd would answer questions and provide context. Scientists and skeptics were invited to examine Mike, and none found evidence of fraud. The University of Utah's authentication was displayed and referenced. The reactions of audiences followed a consistent pattern. Initial skepticism, followed by genuine astonishment, followed by the particular kind of delighted horror that the genuinely bizarre produces in human beings who are confronted with evidence that the world is stranger than they had believed. People who saw Mike described the experience in terms that echo across decades. The cognitive dissonance of watching something that looked like a chicken, moved like a chicken, behaved in the reflexive ways of a chicken, but had no head, produced a quality of shock that normal entertainments could not replicate. You could not quite believe what you were seeing, even while you were seeing it. This is, in a sense, the deepest appeal of the genuine curiosity, as opposed to the fake one. A faked headless chicken would produce a momentary illusion. The real thing produced something more lasting, a genuine revision of what the observer believed was possible. The world, after seeing Mike, was measurably stranger than it had been before. Lloyd, for his part, managed Mike's care on the road with the same practical attentiveness he had shown on the farm. The eyedropper feeding continued milk, water, small grains of corn, several times a day. Mike was kept in a temperature-appropriate environment. His wound site, sealed by the original clotting, remained stable. There were health scares during the road period. At various points, Mike's breathing became labored. The absence of a head meant that the normal drainage and clearing mechanisms of the upper respiratory system were not functioning, and mucus accumulation was a recurring problem. Lloyd developed a technique for clearing Mike's airway using a small syringe, a routine intervention that became part of the daily management of Mike's care. The detail that a farmer from Fruita, Colorado spent 18 months performing what amounts to veterinary respiratory care on a headless chicken, twice daily, because he had committed to the welfare of an animal that had inadvertently become his business partner, and, in some sense, his companion, is one of the more unexpectedly touching details in the story. Lloyd Olsen did not seem to regard Mike as merely a commercial asset, though Mike was certainly that. He spoke about him with a particular quality of affection and respect that suggests a genuine relationship, however one-sided, given Mike's neurological limitations, had developed between them. Mike was family, strange, headless, scientifically improbable family, but family. Mike's case attracted scientific interest that extended beyond the initial authentication, and the questions it raised are ones that neuroscientists and philosophers of mind are still exploring today, though usually in less dramatic contexts. The fundamental question Mike poses is, what is the minimum requirement for life? The answer his case suggests is, less than we think. In the modern understanding of neuroscience, the brainstem, the structure that Mike retained enough of to survive, is understood as the seat of what researchers call vegetative function. This is not a pejorative term. It refers to the automated, unconscious, life-sustaining processes that the brain manages without any input from conscious awareness. Breathing, cardiac regulation, the sleep-wake cycle at its most basic level, fundamental reflexes. Patients in what medicine calls a persistent vegetative state, people who have sustained catastrophic damage to the higher brain while the brainstem remains intact, are, in a very real sense, the human analog of Mike. They breathe, their hearts beat, they have sleep-wake cycles, they may open their eyes, they may make reflexive movements, but they have no conscious experience, no awareness, no subjective inner life. The ethical and philosophical questions raised by persistent vegetative states in human patients are among the most agonizing in medicine. What constitutes life? What constitutes personhood? When, if ever, is it appropriate to discontinue life support for a patient in a vegetative state? These questions have produced some of the most difficult legal and ethical debates in modern medical history. Mike's case illuminates the same territory from an unusual angle, the angle of a barnyard in 1945 with a farmer and an eyedropper. It is harder to access the philosophical gravity of the questions when the patient is a rooster and the treatment is a mixture of milk and corn, but the underlying biology is genuinely analogous. The brainstem keeps the machinery running. The higher brain, the cortex, the forebrain structures, provides the experience of being alive, the awareness that the machinery is running, the subjective feeling of existing. Remove the higher brain and the machinery can persist. But the person, or the chicken, in the meaningful sense of a being with inner experience, is gone. Mike's case also raises questions about what we mean by instinct and reflex, and where the line between them and behavior lies. When Mike pecked at the ground, was he pecking? In what sense? The movement was produced by the same neural circuits that produce pecking in a headed chicken. The physical action was identical, but there was no brain above the brainstem to integrate sensory input, to direct the pecking toward food, to learn from the experience, to associate the action with hunger or satisfaction. It was the form of pecking without the function. This distinction between the form of a behavior and its functional content is one that philosophy of mind takes seriously. We tend to assume that behaviors are expressions of mental states. Mike complicates this assumption by producing the behaviors without the mental states. He also, in a strange way, demonstrates something important about the relationship between structure and function in the brain. The behavioral programs, the pecking, the preening, the roosting, were stored in the brainstem. They ran when the brainstem was intact, regardless of whether there was any higher brain to supervise them. They were, in a sense, the body's autopilot, designed to keep running even when the pilot's seat was empty. This is not entirely unlike what happens in humans. We breathe without thinking about it. We maintain balance without consciously calculating the adjustments. We perform many complex physical actions, walking, cycling, typing, through what neurologists call procedural memory, which is stored not in the cortex but in lower brain structures that can operate below the level of conscious awareness. Mike's case takes this principle to its extreme conclusion. What happens when the autopilot is all there is? The answer, it turns out, is that the plane keeps flying, for a while. Mike the Headless Chicken died in March 1947 in a motel room in Phoenix, Arizona. Lloyd and Mike were on the road, continuing the exhibition circuit that had taken them across the American West for more than a year. They were staying at a modest motor lodge of the type that had proliferated along American highways in the post-war period, catering to the growing culture of automobile travel. In the middle of the night, Mike began to have difficulty breathing. This was not unprecedented. The respiratory management that had been part of Mike's daily care throughout his headless life, the clearing of mucus accumulation using a small syringe, was a routine intervention that Lloyd had become proficient in. It was something that needed to be done regularly, and when it needed to be done urgently, quick access to the syringe was essential. Lloyd could not find the syringe. He had left it at the previous day's show at the exhibition venue, packed in equipment that had not come back to the motel room. By the time he realized this, and by the time any alternative could be arranged, the obstruction in Mike's airway had progressed too far. Mike choked on what was most likely a piece of grain, the small corn pieces that were part of his diet, delivered directly into the esophagus, which in this instance had apparently found its way to where it should not have been. He died in the night. Lloyd Olsen, by his own later account, was devastated. He had spent 18 months caring for this animal, feeding him by eyedropper, managing his health, carrying him across the American West, building a livelihood around him, and developing the particular affection that forms between people and animals in their care, however unusual the circumstances. The loss was genuine. There is an additional detail in the aftermath of Mike's death that says something about Lloyd's character. He told people afterward that Mike had died on the farm, that he had not survived the road trip. He was, by his own later admission, embarrassed by the death. Not embarrassed by Mike, or by the exhibition enterprise, or by any of the 18 months that had preceded it. Embarrassed by the specific manner of the death, the lost syringe, the preventable outcome, the sense that he had failed in his duty of care at the crucial moment. Lloyd Olsen was a man who took his responsibilities seriously, even when the responsibility was to a headless chicken. Mike was not given a particularly formal farewell. There was no burial of note, no memorial, no public acknowledgement of the death commensurate with the fame he had achieved during his life. He was a chicken, and his commercial value had ended with his death, and the world had other things to think about in 1947. But he was not forgotten. Mike the Headless Chicken has been remembered consistently and with great affection for nearly 80 years. This longevity of memory is itself interesting. Why does this story persist when so many stranger and more significant things have been forgotten? Part of the answer is simple. It is a great story. It has all the elements that make stories memorable: the unexpected inciting incident, the against all odds survival, the human dimension of Lloyd's caretaking, the darkly comic arc from farm to sideshow to motel room. It is the kind of story that, once heard, stays heard. But there is something else as well. Mike's story touches something genuine, something that resonates beyond the comedy of the surface narrative. He is, in his way, a figure of pure persistence. Not conscious persistence, not the willed, deliberate, choose-to-keep-going persistence of an Aaron Ralston or a Poon Lim, but the more fundamental, more biological kind of persistence. The tendency of living things to continue, to keep the processes going, to sustain the machinery of life even when the circumstances are, in every meaningful sense, impossible. This is not an inspiring quality in the way that human survival stories are inspiring. Mike did not choose to survive. He did not overcome despair or find a reason to live. He simply continued. In the mechanical way of brainstems and circulatory systems, because the minimum necessary conditions for continuation were met. And yet there is something oddly moving about it, the persistence of life in the most stripped-down, minimal form, the heartbeat that keeps beating, the breath that keeps breathing, the body that keeps going because going is what bodies do until they cannot. Mike also represents something specific about the American character, or at least about a particular strand of it: the willingness to take the genuinely bizarre and make it an attraction, to find commercial possibility in the unexpected, to charge 25 cents admission to see the most extraordinary thing you have ever encountered, and to make no apology for the transaction. There is a directness to this that is, in its way, refreshing. Lloyd Olsen did not pretend that Mike was anything other than what he was: a headless chicken, kept alive by the specific anatomy of an axe wound, exhibited for money. He did not attach false sentiment to it or claim deeper significance. He simply recognized something remarkable and brought it to people who wanted to see something remarkable. The scientists confirmed it was real. The public paid to see it. The magazines reported on it, and Mike, headless, semi-conscious, fed by eyedropper, gained 8 pounds and toured the American West. Fruita, Colorado has leaned into the legacy with characteristic small-town enthusiasm. Mike the Headless Chicken Day is held annually in May, a community festival that includes food, games, carnival rides, and a 5K run called the Run Like a Headless Chicken. The festival draws thousands of visitors to a town of fewer than 15,000 people, generating significant tourism revenue and providing an occasion for the community to celebrate its most improbable claim to fame. There is a statue of Mike in Fruita. He is depicted mid-stride, headless, permanent, a bronze monument to the persistence of life in the face of axe-based adversity. Lloyd Olsen died in 1992, having lived to the age of 89 and having outlived Mike by 45 years. He gave occasional interviews about Mike in his later years and is consistently described as having maintained a warm, matter-of-fact affection for the story, not embarrassed by it, not over-invested in it, but genuinely fond of it. It was the strangest thing that had ever happened to him, and he had handled it with the practical, unflappable good humor of a man who was very comfortable with the strangeness of the world. We have in this series told stories about extraordinary human survival. Aaron Ralston cutting off his own hand to free himself from a boulder. Poon Lim catching sharks from a life raft in the Atlantic. Julian Cope walking out of the Amazon jungle after falling 3 kilometers from a disintegrating aircraft. Hiru Onoda fighting a war that had been over for 30 years because no one he trusted had told him otherwise. Mike the Headless Chicken is not a story about human survival. He was not a human being, and survival, in the meaningful sense of choosing to persist, of finding reasons to continue, was not something he was capable of. He continued because his brainstem did not know he had lost his head. But his story connects to the same deep territory that all survival stories connect to: the boundary between life and death, and what it means to exist on or near that boundary. In all the other stories we have told, the question at the center is, what kept this person alive? And the answer always involves some combination of physical luck and human will, the brainstem and the frontal lobe working together, the body's persistence and the mind's decision to match it. Mike's story strips out the frontal lobe entirely. There is no decision. There is no will. There is only the brainstem, the most ancient, most fundamental part of the brain, the part that keeps the lights on without knowing what the lights are for. And it turns out that this alone, under the right circumstances, is enough to sustain life for 18 months. This is, in its way, both deeply humbling and deeply comforting. Humbling because it suggests that the persistence of life at its most basic level has nothing to do with the qualities we value most in ourselves: our consciousness, our will, our capacity for meaning-making and decision and love. The body keeps going regardless. It does not require any of that. Comforting because it suggests that the machinery of life is more robust, more persistent, more difficult to stop than we might fear. That even in the most extreme circumstances, the basic processes that sustain biological existence will continue as long as the minimum conditions are met. The minimum conditions, in Mike's case, were a partially intact brainstem, a clot in the right place, and a farmer with an eyedropper and the patience to use it 3 times a day for 18 months. Given those conditions, a chicken can live without a head for a year and a half. The world is much stranger than it appears from the outside. In Fruita, Colorado, there is a bronze statue of a chicken mid-stride. The chicken has no head. This is Miracle Mike, the headless wonder, the most famous bird in American history, commemorated in permanent metal in the town where Lloyd Olsen's axe came down on September 10th, 1945, and failed, with spectacular imprecision, to kill a rooster. Mike lived for 18 months without a head. He traveled thousands of miles across the American West. He was examined by scientists, photographed by journalists, and seen by hundreds of thousands of people who paid 25 cents to confirm, with their own eyes, that the world contained things their categories had not prepared them for. He gained 8 pounds. He was insured for $10,000. He was fed by eyedropper, cleared by syringe, and carried in the arms of a Colorado farmer who took his responsibilities seriously especially when those responsibilities were to a headless chicken. He died in a motel room in Phoenix because a syringe was in the wrong bag. Lloyd felt guilty about it for the rest of his long life. Every May, the people of Fruita run a 5K race in his memory. They eat chicken, presumably, without excessive guilt. They celebrate the most improbable chapter in their town's history with the straightforward, unapologetic cheerfulness of people who know they have a good story and see no reason not to enjoy it. Mike did not survive through courage or will or the love of family or the vision of a future worth living for. He survived because an axe landed at a particular angle, because a vein was a few millimeters to the right of where the blade came down, because a brainstem is a remarkably stubborn piece of neural tissue, and because a farmer named Lloyd Olsen decided to feed him rather than finish the job. He was not a hero, he was a chicken. But his story is true, completely, verifiably, scientifically authenticated true. And it is one of the strangest true stories in the history of a world that contains, if you look closely enough, an inexhaustible supply of strangeness. The world is odd. Mike knew this to the extent that he knew anything. Lloyd knew it too. Now you do. Thank you for watching. Mike the Headless Chicken is one of those stories that I find irresistibly fascinating, not just because it is funny, though it is, but because it genuinely illuminates something real about biology and consciousness and the persistence of life. If this video made you laugh or think or both, share it with someone. Subscribe for the next story. And leave a comment. What is the strangest part of Mike's story to you? The survival itself, the weight gain, the 5K race in his memory, or the fact that Lloyd felt guilty about a syringe for the rest of his life? I want to know.